Paul Zalkin, a partner in our restructuring team, interviews aviation experts from the Airline Management Group on the impact coronavirus has had on the sector. Peter Davies is the CEO of Airline Management Group. Ben Leon is Airline Management Group's Chief Commercial Officer. Augusto Viansson Ponte is Director of Strategy and Planning at Airline Management Group. Part 1. The Passenger Airline Sector.
Peter, if I could first turn to you perhaps and just ask for a bit of an overview of the passenger airline sector and the aviation sector more generally, and your thoughts on its importance to global trade, the global economy, and obviously the impact that coronavirus has had, and just your sort of thoughts to start with, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I think it's useful to put these things into some sort of context. It's been argued, and you mentioned the explosion, if you like, of the airline industry since the 50s. And it's well argued, certainly by those inside the industry and by a lot of economists who live outside the airline industry, that the opportunity for globalization, which has obviously happened over the last 20, 25 years, the glue for that essentially was the aviation sector, both in terms of the capability of moving people quickly and cheaply, as well as the cargo. It's such that today, and I quote some IATA numbers, the total combined revenue for the airline industry is around about 850 billion US dollars, so a significant size, of which it's estimated and employs 65 million people. It's estimated that something like 300 to 320 billion dollars worth of revenue is not at risk, it's gone, as of what the current situation is. And as important, if not more importantly, something like 25 million of those 65 million workers are at risk. So obviously significant. The rivulets that run from that basic context is significant in terms of the impact it has on nearly everything that we take for granted in today's modern world. And who knows, today's modern world may well be changing quite dramatically as we move into the future. But I think the important thing in terms of this opportunity to talk to you guys is that there are two key things for me, and my colleagues will come in a second. One is naturally the liquidity. Any company in the current environment is facing that important scenario, and indeed some airlines are short of liquidity, and we suspect they will be going bust fairly soon. There are others who've got fairly deep pockets who can probably see out this current situation for some time. But the some time is the important thing, I think, here, because no matter what the industry does, and we can pontificate and we can position and we can talk about aircraft and very important things which will shape and have some design, ultimately it's going to be the consumer reaction, the consumer demand, how he or she is going to react once we're able to be outside lockdown, once we resume any sort of normal life. And I think that becomes the critical thing in terms of trying to map how the airline industry and the aviation industry and its environs and its support system, which is significant, both in aircraft manufacturers, engines, components, catering, and the whole ramification of the industry is under threat at the present moment. And therefore our job is trying to estimate and understand where the consumer will come from, and that impact in terms of reducing the market demand that's happened over the last few years. So I think they're the two things that is quite important for me to discuss.
So if we were just to focus on the airline sector specifically at the moment, before we broaden the conversation to the wider aviation sector and all of the supply chain, are there particular airlines operating from the UK, predominantly carrying passengers who originate from the UK, who are sort of more vulnerable to failure than others? And if that is the case, why is that?
I think it's probably not a good idea to talk specifically about an airline. We obviously not, we understand their balance sheets, but certainly there are airlines that have been specifically ensuring that their cash values are good and strong. Naturally, the people like British Airways, Ryanair, EasyJet are taking action at the present moment. There are others who are in a more vulnerable position, and not necessarily just the small ones. Obviously, clearly, the small ones, the smaller regional carriers are vulnerable. The bigger ones less so. But I suspect Augusto may have some comment on the liquidity of some of these airlines.
Yes, I mean, balance sheets have been looked at. Liquidity situation of the various airlines has been looked at. Broadly, we can probably see airlines like in different buckets. On one side, we have well-established low-cost carriers such as Ryanair and EasyJet, just to name two household names, that seem to be in a better position than other airlines in terms of liquidity. They have worked quite hardly at bolstering their liquidity position, and they do have a significant number of months of survival mode, even with their fleets largely or entirely grounded. Going forward, they have looked at various ways to increase liquidity. They're looking at sale and leaseback of aircraft. They're looking at new credit lines and so on. So they're probably slightly better positioned than other airlines. On the other end of the spectrum, we have airlines such as Norwegian, notoriously known for being very, very aggressive over the past few years in terms of growth, in terms of launching the new concept of long-haul low cost, highly leveraged, and obviously in a more difficult position to the point that the Norwegian government had to step in and set certain guidelines in terms for them to have access to additional liquidity going forward. So obviously they are on the more dangerous end of the spectrum in terms of liquidity and an opportunity to survive the long term. A different bucket altogether is the one, for example, of the small regional airlines. The small regional airlines that cover a lot of the critical movements of passengers, critical workers, people flying to the oil fields and things like those, or connecting regions of the UK and other regions across the world that are difficult to connect. Obviously, those would be like in an easier position to ask for government support or even state aid should the conditions persist and should they not have sufficient commercial demand in order to continue their operations. So the reality is that every carrier will be in a slightly different position, and every position will be unique and will have to be addressed on an individual basis, to be entirely honest.
Which emphasizes the point, Paul, that many companies will clearly survive, either because they've got the right balance sheet and they've managed their cash properly, or governments may, I think the US have already agreed that they will start pumping millions in. That's all well and good in having a strong balance sheet and liquidity. But the key question is, will the recovery have a short or a long tail? Financially, certainly. So it's good to have clearly a strong balance sheet, fairly obvious, or it be bolstered. But if the consumer reaction after the lockdown is such that it's slow, there may well be a spike immediately afterwards where everyone says, oh, let's disappear. But I think when they get to the airport, they might suddenly realize that perhaps that's not such a good idea. But that aside, if consumer demand does not come back quickly, therefore you have a long tail, then even those companies that have a strong balance sheet will then be put under quite significant pressure.
Yeah.
So we talk about a second wave or a third wave in terms of the virus itself, and the human misery that will bring in. But equally, I think industry, not just the aviation sector, should be talking about the second or third wave of a financial catastrophe should consumer demand not respond as quickly as one would like to think it should.
Well, there's some interesting themes sort of already emerging, and I think we'll sort of move on and talk about some of those in a little bit more detail. That behavioural piece is very interesting.
Yeah.
You know, I suppose it's impossible for airlines to predict exactly how consumers will react. And there are sort of other factors to bring into that conversation. It's also interesting, as Augusto was saying, to look at the differences between different types of airlines operating out of the UK. And I'd like to develop that further. But Ben, perhaps a question that I could put to you. I mean, you worked at Heathrow for a period of time during your career when you were with British Airways. And I'm wondering, I mean, Heathrow is an incredibly important hub airport, European hub airport. Does the dominance of Heathrow as a European hub mean that the UK airline sector is going to be disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus lockdown compared to other European countries and, you know, elsewhere in the world?
Well, I think, Paul, that's a very important point that you make, that Heathrow and the UK as a whole plays a very significant role in aviation, not just for the UK economy, but across Europe and the global economy. And Heathrow is a global connecting hub. And as we know, the importance that it plays in a political context, given the constraints on its growth capacity that have really been holding it back over the last few years with the whole debate about the third runway. But yes, it's absolutely the case that the large hubs like Heathrow are seeing a dramatic impact, and figures recently have come out for Hong Kong, for example, where their March numbers dropped by over 90%. And it's clear that hubs like Heathrow are going to be in a very similar position when the numbers emerge. Over 90% of passengers will have disappeared for this immediate period. And the question is going to be, as Peter and Augusto have said, is what is the nature of the passenger journey? What's the nature of the consumer demand? And how are airports and the airlines going to react? Because at this moment in time, different governments have taken on sort of restrictions on travel, and we can see that as the waves of the virus impacts different countries in different phases, that travel opportunities will not necessarily be synchronized around the world. Things are starting up again in China and in Far East Asia, but we're still very much at the peak or still in a very restricted mode here in UK and Europe. And the question is going to be which routes, where are people going to fly, and the consumer. The question is going to be our immunity status. What is the sort of bio threat that we're going to face? The airline industry has seen many threats that it's had to react to over the number of years. When we look back at the volcano ash, when everything came to a standstill because of the particles in the air, when we look at September the 11th and the impact of terrorism, the industry has responded to that. And after the terrorist attacks, we then see all of the additional security features that come into the airport and aircraft movements and passenger journey. Well, we now have to contend with a whole different case, which is the bio threat. And that bio threat, you know, if we maintain the 2-meter restriction that we have here and social distancing, that will put enormous pressure in terms of passenger flows through the condensed passageways of airports. In addition, on aircraft, you know, the low-cost carriers are all about putting as many seats as possible on board the aircraft. But the question is, will those customers really want to be sitting with 188 others on a narrow-body aircraft? Right now, with the repatriation flights that we're seeing, it's clear that social distancing is being applied on board the aircraft. The crew are for many of the airlines, are being given personal protective equipment. Passengers are being asked to put masks on. Indeed, the Canadian government has recently mandated it. And we've seen the first airline that has actually required passengers to take a test before getting on board the aircraft was Emirates Airlines on flights to Tunisia. And they were the first airline now who have required all their passengers to take a COVID test before being allowed to board the aircraft. Now, we can well see that depending on how vaccinations and how immune systems are going to be tracked, and how the scientific and medical community are going to be able to respond to this pandemic. But you can quite imagine that along with our passport electronic data, we're going to have to carrying some biological electronic data, and which authority is going to be accepted by which country and so forth. So I think there's going to be lots of issues to contend with, and the airline industry is already starting to see that. Airports, airlines, and the whole value chain in terms of the customer journey. So coming back to your point about, you know, is Heathrow going to be disproportionately impacted? Well, you know, it's shrinking its operations right now into just 2 terminals, and that is a massive move for an airport the size of Heathrow. So yes, it's going to have an impact. We can already start to see what the likely impact is going to be, but really and truly, we're all on this journey together right now. And as Peter said right at the beginning, it's that consumer demand, and it's really how comfortable are people going to be in confined spaces. And let's not forget that we're still at the very, very beginning of this from an economic crisis point of view. I mean, the governments here in the UK and across Europe and across the world have really acted very quickly to put some cash into people's pockets right now to try and stem some of the impact on an individual level. But as time goes by, that economic impact is going to hit more and more people. And so not only their propensity to want to travel, but it's also going to be their disposable income that will allow them to travel. And indeed, will they feel comfortable traveling so far away from home? So these are all the questions that as an industry we have to contend with. And each airline will have its own profile of customers and each journey type that it will have to adapt to.
Well, that's really interesting, because again, sorry, Augusto, go ahead.
Well, just to add to what Ben was saying, it's quite interesting because we have been trying to build I wouldn't call it like a forecast model. I would call it like more like a scenario analysis model to sort of try like to ascertain how quickly and how badly are we going to be affected by the industry is going to be affected by all of this. And it's quite interesting how it is almost entirely passenger demand led. Yeah. And constantly, as we're working through this, we keep on adding more and more drivers that have to do with the change in behavior that passengers are likely, whatever degree, likely to have going forward, and how this will impact. And what we're starting to see is that obviously there is this huge drop that Ben and Peter have already talked about in terms of like what are the numbers. And yes, there may be a case of like some increase in the later part of the year, but what seems to be quite evident, and becoming quite evident, is the fact that there will be a long-term impact in terms of consumer behavior and consumer demand that is going to be long lasting. And that will take years to sort of like get back to what the pre-COVID-19 situation will be. So there will be a very long lasting and very deep impact.
Yeah,
I think that there's a balancing act, like most things in life. And my colleagues mentioned two key things, which I think if you put them together, one is disposable income, and that's obviously significantly reduced and will be for some time. And the capability of people wanting to, or being allowed to, whatever becomes the more relevant, in terms of sitting close to each other on board an aircraft. Now, the two key performance indicators in our industry are you need people to have money to buy airfares, and they've been buying them relatively cheaply as a result of advances in the model, the low-cost structure particularly. But at the same time, the airline needs to earn money going forward. So if it's restricted in terms of the middle seat, or even the middle seat I don't think is sufficient, but whatever it is deemed, the capacity of an aircraft is going to go from a theoretical 100% probably to a maximum of 30, 35, 40%. So if you've got a 40% seat load factor, and which means the price will go up inevitably at a time when disposable income is reduced, you can see that's an imbalance where it's going to be difficult to manage that process. So there are no easy solutions to this situation, and as we've been saying, for the sake of repetition, we really do need to begin to understand the behavioural, the science behind how people will react. Just one quick example: my wife and I are booked on a cruise in September. The cruise line hasn't cancelled it yet. I suspect so. It will, but if it doesn't, and the lockdown is released, I have no intention whatsoever of going on board a liner ship with 2,620 other people at this precise moment, or indeed this year. So, and I'm a rational believer. I've travelled extensively, but I'm not going to do that. So, huge impact, massive impact, and I don't think it's really been given the credence or the significance that it should be in terms of the ramifications of our industry. And of course, you can read that into many other industries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in this sort of first part of our conversation, where we're just generally exploring here the nature of the industry. I mean, it's very interesting. We keep coming back to this sort of behavioural piece. Ben's comments on, biosecurity, incredibly interesting. Of course, after 9/11, the world had to get used to a completely new set of security protocols at an airport. And even to this day, we all stand there, don't we, in the security queue with our, clear plastic bags and putting our liquids. And there's still people who don't seem to fully understand that, or, even now it creates a much stickier sort of experience. Yeah. It slows everything down. It's a source of frustration. And now we're going to have this new issue to deal with, which is some sort of certification or some sort of documentation to demonstrate that we are all fit to fly and that we're not going to infect our fellow passengers. I mean, the impact of that from a behavioural change point of view just can't be underestimated. I mean, it's absolutely huge.
In part 2, Paul Zalkin and his guests will discuss airline failure and the impacts and costs associated with that resulting failure. You can watch this on the Quantuma and Airline Management Group's websites and LinkedIn channels. Thank you for watching this episode. For further information, you can contact Paul Zalkin and Quantuma via the links below this film.